I was part of the dose finding trial before the study. So we were like nine. I think it started with 11 and a few people dropped out. So there were nine of us, and we were dosed 5 times. One time was placebo, so 4 dosings. Um, this was very early in the process, and it was because I'm friends with Chris Timmerman, who was and Lisa Luan, who was running the study, and Chris Timmerman was overseeing it. And I just we used to actually live in the same place. Actually, Chris and I spent COVID together with a few other people in a friend's house in the countryside. And he one day was like, "Oh, we're doing this DMT extended state study." I was like, "What's DMT extended state?" And he was like, "Yeah, it's basically going to pump it in intravenously for an extended period of time." And I was like, "Are you looking for people?" He was like, "Yeah, we actually really need people." I was like, and I volunteered on the spot. I remember it
What a
really,
moment.
really well. I remember it, vividly remember it, because I also remember turning around and walking away and being like, "Oh, fuck, what have I done? I don't know if that's a good idea. I don't actually know if I want to be pumped full of DMT for that long." And then I thought, nah, but I actually do.
Alex, how are you, brother?
I'm good, Danny. How are you?
I'm doing amazing. Thank you for being here. Do you go by Alex or by Alexander usually?
I go by Alexander as like my main name, but I go by Ali to my friends. So call me
Ali.
Ali. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm honored. Thank you so much for taking the time. To anybody who doesn't know, Ali was one of the first. What do you call it? Test subjects?
Yeah, I don't know what participants probably. Yeah,
Participants. Okay.
guinea pigs. I think guinea
Guinea
pigs
pig
probably the right.
was one of the first guinea pigs for DMTx. Which, by the way, to anybody who read Strassman's first book, it didn't go too well to the first people who tried it. They dosed them like 10 times more.
Yeah, right.
So you were one of the first participants in the study of I guess it's not DMTx, right? It's very confusing. It's the Imperial College in London, and DMTx is only what's happening in Colorado, and people confuse the two, or it's all under the same umbrella.
I would say it's under the same umbrella. I mean, the official name of the study was DMT extended state. DMTx. We were calling it DMTx, and then I think the guys in Colorado are calling it that. But it's the same thing. It's the same tech, right? So it's
It's the same idea.
Yeah, same idea, just happening in different places. And the Imperial one happening as a research study. And I think they're probably doing research in Colorado as well, but it'll be different. It'll be less sort of clinical trial style than the Imperial one, and probably fewer tests and questionnaires that hopefully they have to fill out, because we had to fill out a lot, which is it's very expensive to do. So they try and, I think, get as much data as possible, which is understandable. Yeah.
So first of all, I would love to dive into this, but first I want like a short. You just put out a book recently, a new book called The Bigger Picture, which I read, and I have to say I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it, and obviously all the links and all the stuff will be in the description, and also it's going to appear on the screen. Why do you have this extensive experience in writing? I want to know a little bit about your background before we talk about the studies.
Yeah, well, I mean, I am a writer, I would say, as my profession, and my let's say, like, the thing I've always wanted to do since I was like I think maybe 8 or 9 years old. I was just knew, like, I want to be a writer, and I started reading like novels really early when I was like 10. I used to go to like the high school library, and I don't know, I was just obsessed. It's just, I don't quite know what it is. I just absolutely love reading, writing. I'm about to start writing fiction again. That's how I started out, writing fiction, and then I started writing essays. And so that's kind of what I write now. I write a lot about non-psychedelic subjects, and I suppose kind of like an armchair sociologist in some ways. It's not actually my academic training, but it's really what I'm interested in is why do we behave how we behave? Why do we do what we do? What's the deep code of culture? And I think you find that in stories, you find it in movies, you find it in how people respond to world events. And I just find it endlessly interesting. So I've always been also just really interested in the craft of writing, just the actual process of it, how to make something engaging and interesting and tell a story. So that's my and I did do English literature at university, and have been writing for writing either articles, working as some kind of doing something journalistic for my whole like adult life as well. So the bigger picture of my book kind of combines obviously those two loves, or three of those, right? I've been involved in the psychedelic field for also all of my adult life, and then been writing, and then also been very interested in the bigger picture, like what is going on, how do we make sense of the world right now, how do we navigate it effectively, and so that the book is sort of a combination of all of those together.
One of the things you talk about in the book, and I think this is, the more psychedelics become more mainstream and more people are aware of them, and we're noticing this. Essentially, it's the new, like you call the new psychedelic renaissance. And you outlined really beautifully in the book, and I'll let you talk about this. You talk about the main difference between what we're facing now and how it happened in the 60s. What is the main difference? And I know it's a very large subject, but if you have to summarize it, what would be the main difference between now and the 60s?
Oof. Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, definitely a caveat that this is basically, I would say, a summary, but I would say one of the main, like, if I had to lean on one, I would say the most fundamental difference is that we've moved from in the 60s, a bipolar world where we had like the US and the USSR and these two huge ideologies of socialism and capitalism. And in some ways, not that there weren't other ideologies at play, but in some ways there was a kind of order and stability to, culture is always in flux, but let's say there was a sense of like some kind of there was a clear thing that people were pushing back against in the 60s in the counterculture, right? They were pushing back against mainly with civil rights issues, and then to a lesser extent other issues around freedom of spirituality, etc. But there was a real sense of clarity around what's this countercultural, or what they called the underground at the time. What is the underground resisting against in the West, for example, right? And then, of course, the underground in the USSR was listening to rock music and, passing around bootleg cassette tapes and stuff like that, and wearing blue jeans, right? So you have the kind of like the polarity. We now live in a multipolar world, right? So that geopolitically and culturally, so geopolitically, we don't have this like neat world order that splits evenly between the sort of, capitalist and socialist. We have much more of a chaotic and fragmented and unpredictable global order right now. So we obviously have quite a lot of geopolitical instability at the moment. But that's one thing. The other thing, and the thing I'm most interested in, is that we have a cultural fragmentation. So we have what my friend Peter Limburg calls mimetic tribes in the culture wars. So it's not just I'm progressive, you're conservative. It's actually loads of different tribes. It's people who are like trans rights. It's people who are conservative. It's people who are libertarian or transhumanist, or all these different tribes that have their own sort of ideological fixations, fears, and hopes. And the main difference is that it's happening online. And the online world is this psychedelic, constantly changing, full of symbols, things erupt and burst into culture and then disappear. That's what they didn't have in the 60s. That's one of the main things. So we have this actually much more psychedelic, I would say psychedelic baseline. And by psychedelic, I mean that it is boundary dissolved. It's unpredictable. There's a lot of unconscious material just spilling out everywhere. We don't know when it's going to erupt. There's a kind of a sense of unreality that a lot of people feel. A lot of people felt during COVID, for example, but a lot of people felt from the sort of the big political shifts of Brexit and Trump. We've had this whole inversion where the progressives of the 60s are now playing the role, or have evolved into the role of the restrictive, language policing mainstream of culture and media. Whereas you then have its tribes on the right who have the funnier jokes, who are more subversive, who are more edgy. And a lot of people haven't caught up to that yet at all. They haven't caught up to the fact that the progressive project is now the mainstream. It's not to say it's any better or worse than, say, right-leaning tribes. It just means that we're in this upside down, very unpredictable landscape where we just don't know. Well, we have a really hard time agreeing on truth together. That's going on. We also have this, what John Vervaeke calls a meaning crisis, a sort of crisis of meaning in the West, which is, what the hell are we here for, and what are we doing, and why? And the answer to that is consume. And a lot of people feel like that's not a sufficient answer and is meaningless. So we have this very fragmented. And in fact, my Peter Limberg, who I just mentioned, he's on my mind because I spoke to him recently and recorded something with him. He talks about this idea of like the anti-culture that a lot of people right now in the art world and elsewhere, and some different groups are like, there is no real culture right now. Like, what is culture? There's this endless repetition of Marvel movies and Disney movies, and this kind of enforced message of what we should be striving for, but there isn't really a deep sense of connection, longing, purpose at the heart of things. So I feel that too in some ways, aesthetically right now. There's this kind of, so what? So we've veered between nihilism and narcissism culturally quite a bit. Yeah, so I'll pause there. That's a bit of a download of the
No, it is a really good download. That would that go to the heart of what you talk about in the book, about the difference between cultural revolution and revolution in consciousness? That there's a recognition that there's something about culture that is not quite as substantial as we previously considered it, and there's like a deeper underlying underpinnings of what it means to be a human versus being an American or European or Middle Eastern person, whatever it is. But while at the same time entertaining the idea that maybe there is also work to be done on different levels of emergence, which means that, yes, we understand that culture might not ultimately bring us to the promised land, but there is still the structure, the cultural structure that holds us together as a country, as an American, as whatever it is, that also needs, let's say, reconstruction. It needs attention of a certain flavor, and then connecting the new revolution in consciousness to the machinery of culture, versus what I had at least understood in the book, and you can correct me if I misunderstood, but what I understood in the book is that what happened in the 60s, essentially, there was a big disconnect between thinking about cultural revolution, consciousness revolution, so, the whole Timothy Leary thing, which is just like, no, just full force ahead, drop out, everything is going to be okay as long as you focus just on consciousness. And there was a lot of other revolutionary movements that focused more on the political landscape around, the whole racial thing. Mm-hmm. And they even looked at what Timothy Leary was doing in not quite a positive light, because they said, this is quite the delusion you have, sir, because you're a white, rich man that doesn't understand the real plight of the people who have less and have to deal with things that you can't even comprehend. So to bring it down to a question, would you say that the way you view it here, and you can even, expand beyond what you wrote in the book, would you say that is the main difference now, that we're noticing that if we want to move forward in a constructive way, we cannot do like we did in the 60s, where we just separated the two, and then just like consciousness, or culture. You have to go, okay, what does culture need from the consciousness revolution, and then build bridges that connect with smoother processes that allow us to intake these big changes in our understanding of what we are and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty solid description there. So to build on that, yeah, my argument is in part that basically I would say what Timothy Leary was missing by aside from integrity, but come back to that. But what he was missing was, and this is true of anyone who thinks that simply enough people, quote unquote, waking up is going to then hit like a tipping point and everyone's going to be singing Kumbaya and be transcending to the ninth dimension. Just total bullshit. That's also not to say that a change in self-awareness and consciousness and interconnectedness and the sacred isn't really powerful, but it is really powerful, and I do think that's what we need. But one of the things he was doing, the mistake he was making was confusing, I think, a complex problem for a complicated problem. So a complicated problem has basically, it can have many moving parts, but they're all interconnected in a really closed way. And it's like, okay, well, if the problem is that people aren't compassionate enough and we're at war, then people just need to be more compassionate and have more consciousness, and that'll fix the problem. But actually, it's a complex problem, which means it has many overlapping systems are influencing each other, blending together, emerging, collapsing. There's fragility, there's chaos. And that's what really the world is like, whether you're talking about culture or your own inner world, whatever it is, everything is complex. Most things are complex. So that means that in some way there has to be a blend between the insights, like you were saying, of the sonic consciousness revolution and the really down-to-earth, practical, policy-based, realistic, actionable approaches to actually getting shit done and changing things. Those two worlds don't often talk to each other. And I'm involved in a bunch of systems change communities who, veer much more on the theoretical side of metamodernism and what needs to be done and etc. And they don't involve policymakers, and they don't bridge those things. And it's like, that's totally fine to philosophize, but if the philosophy has no actionable impact, then you're just masturbating basically. And it's just like, what is the point? So, or it has limited impact, let's say. So I think there's something much like, for me, psychedelics coming into culture now, my hope is that they can be used to bring more psychedelic approaches toward various problems that we are all collectively facing, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that we are going to get the insights of solving those problems from psychedelics, although that's not impossible as well, right? But it just means that my argument is that the way that psychedelics teach us how to think and be, and the cognitive flexibility, the ability to deal with a lot of intensity and still navigate it and keep our agency, the ability to let go and surrender when we need to, all of those skills are exactly the skills that we need right now in this time in history, particularly to navigate the online world. So it is about a psychedelic, I like the term from Hieronymo Masaras. He spoke at Breaking Convention on a panel that I was hosting, and he was talking about the psychedelic enlightenment, that the psychedelic renaissance is over and it's time for the psychedelic enlightenment. And I really liked that, really stuck with me, because I think for me, what that psychedelic enlightenment really means is that it goes beyond the just kind of mechanistic version of how psychedelics might change things into a much richer, more complex approach to okay, what does it mean to take a psychedelic approach to finance, right? What is a more interconnected, approach to that, with a lot more cognitive flexibility and understanding of the deep inner world and how that relates to everything we're doing in an office, for example, at all these different levels happening at once. That for me is one of the great gifts of psychedelics, aside from the amazing teachings, the amazing interpersonal teachings and growth. That is this it's a way of being in the world, right? It's a way of seeing things and a way of being in the world. And I think we need more of that. I don't think it's going to solve every problem we have, but I think it's a really timely in many ways that psychedelics are going mainstream.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you for this analysis. It's something that I've recently heard Yuval Noah Harari talk about, and obviously he's talking about in the context of what's going on with the war and about history in general, which is his field. And he said something that on the face of it should be obvious to all of us, and nevertheless, the most obvious things we never think about them. He said that people always think about chain of events. And he said you couldn't be more wrong about something in history if you think about things in terms of chain of events. Things don't just happen and then another thing happened, another thing happened. If you ask me as a historian, he said, what caused the Second World War? I don't know. There's a lot of different things that happen, and a lot of people look at it from different angles, but it's always more like a tree. It's like a network, that a lot of things happen at the same time that cause a lot of other nodes to occur, and then it couldn't happen that way. But when you analyze the situation, you always have to be aware that whatever your view is, it will always have this very, very complex network of causes that cause a lot of little things, and then you have all these things connect. And I feel that if I have to put my finger on what one of the things that is really different now is that we're now in a world where this thing we kind of bash, the fact that kids, always in front of screens and all of that stuff. Yes, I am certain that under certain conditions like we have now where, Instagram favors only a particular kind of content that you basically just keeps you on the screen as long as you possibly can. Yes, it can probably do some psychological damage. I don't know actually enough about the research about the suicide rate with teenagers, all that stuff. I'm sure there's definitely something there. But on the other hand, there's this other studies that show that kids at a certain age that literally they can actually multitask in a way that we don't comprehend. Like they can literally be with two screens and they're paying full attention to both of them. So it actually gives them the ability to work networks much easier. And I feel like that can actually, if it's honed the right way, it can actually contribute to this understanding of the world for more of what it is, because what the world is more of a network of things that are occurring. But it has to be accompanied by, for lack of a better term, the wholesomeness of what all the different kinds of enlightenments can bring about. So, when you practice Vipassana, you come out of a silent retreat, there's a certain way with which you carry yourself that you didn't before. And it's very noticeable. It really feels a little bit like Neo stopping bullets sometimes. But if you just do that and you don't focus on the technical problems, once again, you have the whole situation with the plane with one wing missing. So it always have to be balanced. And what I'm hearing you say is that we can't look at things anymore. The naivete of people in the 60s were just like, just do this one thing and everything is going to be okay. That is slowly, maybe not fading, but there's definitely a lot more awareness that things are not as simple as they look. And I even see the whole idea that the postmodernist thrust of there is no ultimate truth. It's a preliminary attempt at getting at this fact that the perception that we have is definitely not the full picture, but it is still lacking because, of course, there's an underlying condition, whatever it is, even if you want to say that all there is mind, I'm open to whatever, but that is the underlying condition. And you can still understand things in the context of that. So something that you touched on, and I really don't want to forget about asking you before we dive into some of the experiments. You were talking about this experiment you were a part of in decentering. Like you when you have to basically, you have to watch the content that is the opposite to your usual conviction and views. So let's say if you're, a Republican, you have to watch left-wing content. If you're
the reverse media diet.
The Fox News. Which, when I thought about it, oh wow, that must be so painful in the beginning, and you even say so in the book. What I wanted to ask you, how long would you say before it stops being painful and becomes slightly enlightening? As to how long did it take you before you heard a point spoken that you said, okay, maybe I now see a little better what they want to say, what they mean. Like there was less of a resistance by you.
Yeah, interesting question. I think I've always had some resistance, but it's about what do you do with the resistance, right? I want to touch on that. Just one thing I want to. You said some really interesting stuff before, and there was something that I thought was just interesting in terms of really obscure DMT stuff, knowledge, right? What relates to what you're saying. So this idea of, Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, and actually I think he has two PhDs, one in English. He was an English professor and then he became a psychiatrist. He's a really brilliant thinker, and he wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, which is very popular, and he's really reviving the idea of the left and right hemispheres and the way that they process things differently. So there's a lot of caveats to that also, because that got a really bad rap in the 80s. It was like, oh, the left hemisphere is logical and the right hemisphere is creative, and etc. That's somewhat true, but not really true. So he goes into all the detail and all the research into where it's like it's not entirely true, but it's actually weirdly there is a lot of truth to it. And his argument is that we have culturally moved into the left hemisphere's view of the world, and the left hemisphere sees things as broken down into component parts. Things are more linear, things are literal. The right hemisphere is the network, interconnected. Everything's implicit. Everything is metaphorical, and that's very just vaguely describing it. So it's called the master and his emissary because the master is meant to be the right hemisphere, which gives us this broad view of the world. And then the left helps us like zoom in and like kind of focus on the parts. So the Enlightenment gave us a whole worldview where we just focus on all the parts and everything is reduced. It's reductionism, right? Everything's reduced to its individual components. I think that's partly why we're so bad at looking at the world, like, the Yuval Noah Harari point you made, at looking at the world as this complex, interconnected, many things, like everything's trans-contextual. Things are true in one moment, but in a different context, they're not true. That's the work of Nora Bateson. And so we are just not trained to see like that. We could be, but we're not. We're not in school trained to see like that, right? So we have to train ourselves later as an adult. And so that's really, so when I was writing the book, I talked to Ian because I've done a lot of projects with him when I used to have a project called Rebel Wisdom, and we had him on a bunch of times. So I'm really familiar with his work. And it was really interesting talking to him. And then afterwards, reading something in Rick Strassman's book, second book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, where he talks about this one really, last name is Jane. I forget the first name, I think. Maybe Thomas Jane is the guy who played the Punisher, isn't it? Just a different guy. It's a different person. But this person who was talking about earlier than McGilchrist, the left and right brain, and he had this theory that the voice of God, like the voice of prophecy, was the two hemispheres of the brain talking like from one, like speaking together from one perspective, and that it was helpful for our ancestors walking through the desert, etc. And so Strassman just mentions this sort of in the book, and I wrote to him and asked, like, a little bit more detail, but it was really just more kind of a speculative, maybe. And I just thought it was very interesting, right? Like, really, like this pickle could really go down to what we have prioritized in culture around the brain. So then that leads in a little bit to your second question about the decentering and about the, actually decentering is something slightly different. I'd say the reverse media diet is more like exposure therapy of basically, if you watch Fox News, you watch CNBC, or if you read The Guardian, you start reading, a conservative newspaper, whatever it might be. And what's interesting about it is super difficult. It is really difficult. It's very painful. And the thing is, I'm not particularly, I'm fairly politically homeless. So there are things on the left that I agree with a lot, and things on the right.
I'm gonna adopt that.
Yeah, it's not my phrase.
I'm definitely politically homeless.
Yeah. A lot of people are, and it's like, but there's elements on both sides that really bother me quite a bit. So, but what's interesting is that you're right in the sense that there's a level of decentering. If you're reading both and you're going like, hey, Fox News, now I'm going to read the opposite, and then I'm going to go to this place and this place, you're getting these multiple perspectives. And really what you need is to be able to hold the multiple perspectives within a wider wholeness in yourself. And this is the reason why postmodernism is such a mess, because it's such a good impulse. I totally agree with you. It's a natural part of human development. And Ken Wilber and Integral, they talk about this a lot. It's natural part of development that we will go, okay, and this is what happened in the 20th century. We had all these fixed truths, and we were like, nationalism, this is the role of men and women, this is what it means to be a good person. And then World War I happened, and then culturally there was this real questioning, and that was modernity, that was modernism. It was like, wait a minute, everything from the famous poem, the center cannot hold, right? The Blake, it's not Blake, sorry, the Yeats poem. So the sense of everything is fragmenting, and we're kind of anxious about it. And that was really artists and writers in the 1920s and 1930s, and then up until World War II, we're really grappling with that. Like, well, if there's no certainty left, and our big grand narratives about what it is to be alive and what the world is are bullshit, because just like millions of young men were just killed, it's a total mess, whatever we're doing is obviously not the right thing to be doing, what do we do? And then after World War II in the 50s and 60s, then postmodernism came about. And that was, hey, let's play with it. Let's celebrate that everything is relative. There's no ultimate truth. Everything is like, we have this kind of like flooding of advertising and media at the same time. It's like, yeah, what is art? Well, it can be fucking anything you want it to be, because, you know, and now what we have culturally is we have that same sort of post-structuralism and cultural relativism applied to culture. And that's the dominant, or has been, I think it's changing now, has been since 2015, 2016, the dominant paradigm in movies, in HR offices, in like, basically there's a kind of sense of, if you identify something, you express something, that then it's language violence in order to contradict that, right? And so there's a lot of good that can come with that, like, because one of the really good things about postmodernism is that it looked at what's happening on the fringes of culture. Who are the people left out of the narrative, and how do we tell their stories? And so it's all about power. And I actually really agree with that. I think social interaction is very much based around power, and we really need to understand power, and because fairness is really fucking important. So we need to figure out, hey, whose voices have been marginalized, so that those voices can come in the middle. Unfortunately, most of the time that good impulse succumbed to a real deep cultural narcissism, where it just became another power game, right? It's just so that it becomes like, whoever's most marginalized gets the most attention, and therefore you're incentivized to be the most marginalized, which is a mess. And that's what the right are so angry about often. And then people on the left are like, hey, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because it is still important to have marginalized voices present and in power positions, which I think is absolutely true. So it's a big fucking mess, right? So
center left, which is
yeah,
very, it's like we're tiny margin now. Center left,
yes,
and center right,
yeah,
but yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So then, you know, I've become, you know, I've for years been looking at this phenomena and writing about it and making films about it. And my perspective on it is that postmodernism, without some sense of, and this is actually not even my idea, this is Lyotard said this, like, was one of the fathers of post-structuralism. He was like, okay, if we keep deconstructing everything forever, we're going to go fucking, he didn't say this quite like this, but this is summarizing a few people's ideas. We're going to go fucking crazy, because you cannot have no truth. You can't have a foundational grounding in the social reality where we can be like, no, that's not true. So he said, without the sublime, so the sublime is this idea of awe, of like encountering something that's totally beyond your ability to describe it. It goes beyond language. It's just this overwhelming, interpenetrating isness that's just like a huge, beautiful mountain. It's like, you're going to fucking socially analyze a mountain, right? You can't talk about the mountain and its trauma history or whatever bullshit, right? So you just have this kind of thing. And so I really agree with that. For postmodernism to work, you have to have all that deconstruction and all that cultural relativity happening with a much wider metaphysical frame of what is real and what is reality. Religion used to give us that frame, but doesn't anymore, or it does, but not as many people are listening, and attendance is down worldwide. I think evangelical churches are still doing fairly well, because there's an ecstatic expression in that, right? So, but overall,
there's quite a rise in some places in the world, but it's a very long subject, so we can
yeah, exactly. So and religion will come back, absolutely. I think we're living already in religious times, and I think they will get more so, especially I think with the advent of AI religions, which I would imagine is already happening. So my point being that back to the reverse media diet, if we can stay connected, I think, to some sense of value and virtue, and a sense of there are innate human qualities like freedom or justice or truth that are real and are transcendent, then we can entertain multiple perspectives. But if we don't have any sense of anything mattering, and everything is just like many perspectives babbling over each other, then we get totally lost, because how am I going to contextualize all these different perspectives? It's just going to be like total white noise. So that's where I think it's really important. And that's what the sacred is. It's something that goes beyond the social and language games.
Well, once again, brilliantly outlined. I would say that to me, always, just to piggyback on a couple of points there, the one thing that became very clear, it was bugging me for a long time. Like, what is it that really bothers me about postmodernism? And then I realized it. They started as it always happens, they started from a good place of just allowing everybody have their say, in a sense. So like whatever you perceive is as real as what I perceive. But then they started conflating, just like you talk about in the book, with it. All of a sudden the social justice was imported into corporate world, and then it lost. It kind of went to be the opposite of what it was. In this case, what happened is that they basically did have a truth statement. And their truth statement was, the truth is always that there is no truth.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, they put a thing on the bottom that cannot be passed. Before that, it was just physical reality. And now they said, no, it's just that there is no truth. If you're convinced there's a truth, you're wrong. And I think that really, everything you described, this cycle of when people go to different modalities of operation socially, you can obviously outline this in many different ways, but the fourth turning is one way of looking at it, which is like the cycle of fourth, when there's an uprising, which it feels like where we're at right now. There's like a war, then the people don't want anything to do with violence and war, so everything is chill, and so on and so on. The way I see it is that it's not quite a circle. It's more like Earth going through space, the solar system going through space. It's not just spinning, it's going like this, right? Because it's moving through space itself with the galaxy. So in the bigger picture, these social turnings, they're going somewhere. And I think where they're going is that, yes, we repeat the same cycle, but eventually you go, wait a second, like we're going right now, which before probably people didn't have that. They didn't go, wait a second, we did this before. Like they did it many times before, but nobody said, wait a second, we did this before. So
That's
now we are saying, wait a second, we did this before. So even though it's in its infancy, it is the beginning of something new, where we are recognizing a more universal structure that we're a part of that is actually happening like this. And I think that this is something that at the edge of, so when people, their job is to think on a very high level, again, my brain always goes to physicists, but obviously a lot of different disciplines do this. But in physics, it's very pronounced, where a really good scientist or a really good physicist, they can hold many different theories at the same time about the same thing, and they describe different portions of the thing, and they don't agree in different portions of the space, but they live with it because it does do enough work in every single part of the domain where it needs to do work. And this ability to just hold all of these things in view while at the same time not, so to speak, being stuck in the spider web, like not actually, it's like the spider being stuck in the spider web is the problem. So like if you can walk on the web but without getting stuck to it, don't get too attached to it, because you need to understand that it will always shift to something else. But you don't need to marry an idea like there is no truth, because of course there is. Even if we'll never know it, whatever the situation is, that's the truth. Yeah. So it's almost like if you just go this one extra mile, and the reason I'm mentioning this particular thing, because I feel it's a very universal principle. It doesn't just apply here. I feel that whatever it is your conviction about anything, if you just go the extra mile and say, yes, our perspectives can be so numerous as to almost say that all these perspectives have something to say that is off value about what the actual truth is. But I don't need to go as far as to say that there is no truth. I just know that my perspective is a limited thing of it, and that's a simple thing to say, and you can kind of glide through. Yeah. There's so many things there that you said that just, I really want to dive in, and my brain is on fire. But I know that listeners would definitely want to hear a little bit about the studies, so I wanna veer there. And maybe if we have a little bit of time after, we'll go back to it. By the way, one small thing that I wanted to say. Well, you said talk about the corporate world. One place where I saw myself having this decentering happening in real time, which was very interesting to me, because I'm, the whole social justice thing, it's like it's a very confused enterprise to me, in many ways. But then there was one moment where I was speaking to a friend of mine who was very much in that world, and something all of a sudden clicked for me, which I was like, wait a second. Yes, because when you go to the corporate world, if you just focus on the quota, right, of how many people of different flavors you have, then you kind of shoot the enterprise in the foot, because the point is to have productivity. So if the point is productivity, then it doesn't make any sense. But then he made me realize, but if you look at if you zoom out, we have everything we need. We don't need more productivity per se. What about including more people that don't get to enter the picture because of different social slices that don't allow them to do that? And I was like, okay, that's a really good argument. Yeah, because ultimately, like you said, we want more well-being. We have all the wealth in the world, at least in the Western world. Now we want to try and include more people, and we need to figure out how to do that. So anyways, that was just kind of like a moment for me. So yeah, let's dive into the studies. How did you end up there? And well, let's start with that. How did you end up being part of the study?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was part of the dose finding trial before the study. So we were like 9, I think it started with 11 and a few people dropped out. So there were 9 of us and we were dosed 5 times. 1 time was placebo, so 4 dosings. So this was very early in the process, and it was because I'm friends with Chris Timmerman, who was, and Lisa Luan, who was running the study, and Chris Timmerman was overseeing it. And I just, we used to actually live in the same place. Actually, Chris and I spent COVID together with a few other people in a friend's house in the countryside. And he one day was like, "Oh, we're doing this DMT extended state study." I was like, "What's DMT extended state?" And he was like, "Yeah, it's basically going to pump it in intravenously for an extended period of time." And I was like, "Are you looking for people?" He was like, "Yeah, we actually really need people." I was like, and I volunteered on the spot. I remember it really well. I remember it, vividly remember it, because I also remember turning around and walking away and being like, "Oh, fuck, what have I done? I don't know if that's a good idea. I don't actually know if I want to be pumped full of DMT for that long." And then I thought, "No, but I actually do." So my driving force with it was just pure curiosity and excitement of being like, yeah, let's, bring it. So they were looking for people who were pretty experienced psychonauts. So like, myself and Carl H. Smith and Jack Aloka and Leo Roseman. And then there were others who I haven't actually connected with because I'm not personally friends with them who were on that dose finding trial, who I presume were also seasoned psychonauts. So then I entered like a pretty intense training regime that was not required from the trial. That was just mine, because I was like, okay, actually, I'm going to be in DMT space for a longer period of time. I really want to come back with something useful. And, because I'm interested in all this bigger picture, sociological, state of the world stuff. I was like, maybe there's, like Terence McKenna said, maybe I can come back with a medium-sized idea. That'd be awesome. So then, interestingly, the first 3 dosings, they were very, very powerful, very profound, very personal. The personal and metaphysical blended together. I talk about that in the book. That was like a big surprise for me in some ways, even though it seems really obvious, but it was real, like, it was very humbling. And then the 5th dosing, which the 4th actual dosing, was totally mind-blowing. But let me explain actually what happened in the trial first, because so we would go in just in a hospital room in Hammersmith Hospital here in London, and get an EEG helmet put on, which took like 40 minutes, like 200 little suckers around the head, and then do a whole bunch of questionnaires and cognitive tests, which I became super suspicious of, because I was like, there was one test that I'm pretty sure was just about my response to flickering light. But it made you do these things where you had to like press a button, and I was like, eventually I was like, it was really like, do you ever watch Lost? Yeah. When Desmond's in the hatch? I was like, there's fucking numbers, don't do anything, this is bullshit. I just was like that, and I was like, fucking shit. So there was like, there was like a lot of actual science going on, obviously, that I was a guinea pig in. And then for the dosing, so we had a cannula in my left arm was a cannula, so like a permanent needle kind of stuck in with like connected to a pump, the DMT pump. And in my right arm was there was a doctor, and then taking blood like every 2 minutes, so that they could look at the blood levels of DMT and then look at what was going on at each time and compare that data. And then so the DMT was pumped in for 30 minutes, but always for me, and I presume everyone else, it's more like a 40-minute experience, because as soon as the pump stops, then you've got, it's like the equivalent of you just smoked a lot of DMT and then you're metabolizing it, right? So pump stops 30 minutes in, and then it's not like the DMT just gets sucked out. It's still in there. But interestingly, I did ask them about this, because they were like, it'll end right after the 30 minutes. And they were like, and if at any point you needed to stop, just let us know and it'll stop. And I was like, No, it won't. It's still going to be like another 10 minutes. Okay. But anyway, so it definitely was 40. It was for
I
sure
was
40
actually wondering
minutes.
about that, so thank you. Thank you for
Yeah.
letting me know.
Yeah. So it was definitely like 40 minutes of experience. And then, of course, we were lying down for an hour. So you're still kind of in an afterglow, and usually me processing like what a big experience. And then we would recount the experience, which, by the way, just for any psychonauts, I think is such a good technique. And I've started doing it more since the study myself, is that we would just speak in the first person in real time, like an hour later, an hour after the trip, then be like, okay. And so Lisa would be there with like this kind of like paper that had the timeline of the trip, and they had like looked at everything. They'd be like, okay, start from the beginning. Okay, so then you'll be like, okay, the dose comes in, and immediately, like like I have a lot of intensity in my body. I'm in this. I always came into the same place. A lot of people have this with DMT. I was always in. Yeah. Go on.
I know
Sorry, go
people
on.
will wonder. No, just I take a small technical. I know people will wonder how fast. Like this second ago, it's just like immediate or
Immediate. Like it's just like boom. And it was really the most nerve-wracking part of the whole process for me was waiting for the dose to come in, because it was they didn't tell us when it would come in, and I asked them if they would, and they were like, for the data, people's heart rate go up if they know. I was like, oh,
it's like
man.
a roller coaster.
Oh,
it's like
God,
one of these rides where you sit up and it just you're waiting for the thing to like unleash.
Yeah, it was a while. It was like it was like 5 to 10 minute wait. So that was the worst bit, because it was just like, because also after the first time I knew that it was going to hit, and I would feel this kind of slightly cold feeling in my arm, and then be like, okay, fuck, it's happening. And it was just like smoking DMT. It's just like instant. It's like being, it was a bit like dropping into the most intense ayahuasca experience you've ever had, instantly, without any kind of time to kind of come up. So a lot of my training, yeah.
So just this quick part, and I remember where you stopped. Don't worry. You when you get there, like the immediate thing, is it kind of like smoking, like because it gets to places that you can't get to when you smoke, right?
Yes.
It's like it goes
definitely. Yeah.
But that's where you land right away, or it kind of builds.
No,
really?
I would say that's that's where we land right away. And it would be like, and all of our heart rates, I think, doubled, or you can actually find it in Lisa's, the study has already been put out. So I think the heart rate data is in there. It definitely felt like that. It was just like very bodily intense, like boom. And it would, yeah. So
you said you always landed the same place in the beginning.
Yes, exactly. So I would always be in this kind of what felt like a holding area, to be honest, like not so different from Strassman's studies. And a lot of people talk about this, their DMT experiences. And I was in this kind of like cavern, like dome cavern, very much a sense of being enclosed, and usually quite alone. Like sometimes there was like a kind of orb in the center, but it wasn't conscious in some sense. So I would be in there or something like that. And then usually I would break through that in some way by just being very, so the first couple of minutes, a lot of my training, so the meditations, I worked with a great facilitator called Trish Blaine, who I worked with every week for the last like 3 years, who's kind of specializes in non-ordinary experiences and states. And so I was like, okay, what I want is to train myself to, like Terence McKenna used to say, don't give way to amazement. Some of the entities told him that once. They were like, don't give way to amazement. We've got stuff to show you. So I was like, okay, that was my motto. I was like, I basically need to train myself to not give way to amazement. So I keep my shit together. For the first 2 minutes, I just had to let myself just breathe and ride the intensity of it, because that was just like the state change was very intense. And then I would settle, and then I'd be in the dome or something like the dome. And sometimes I was even like, hello, anyone here? I'd literally like mentally call out. And then I would just try and find any kind of movement or something or salience in the landscape. Like, okay, what's going on over there? Or maybe I can see something moving there in my mind's eye. Like, and then that would often like open out. The thing is, like, I would break through. I always had this teaching presence, as I call it. And I get that with all psychedelics, this kind of guiding voice, right? Like the kind of teaching presence of the DMT. And so it was guiding me through the landscapes and a lot of entity encounters, but I was also doing really deep inner work, and it was mainly about these very powerful inner transformations and like really facing stuff that was hard to look at and really even through the entity encounters, getting lessons about like, my relationship with intimacy, and my trust in women and men and everyone, right? Like all of this different
That
stuff.
was the most impactful part of your book, by the way, for me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think it was actually probably one of the most impactful parts of my experience, right? So that was incredible. And there was a sequence a bit like with ayahuasca. I found this. I think a lot of people report this. It's a kind of like you start where you left off in some ways, right? And so it was every 2 weeks the dosings, and I would come in and it was like, okay, lesson on intimacy level 2, along with a lot of entity encounters, and then lesson on intimacy level 3, and then in the fifth dosing, which was a bonus dosing, I don't think they refer to it like that, but there was a gap of 6 months, and I was already writing the book. And then they got in touch and were like, do you want to come in for an extra dose? And I thought, yeah, I mean, yes, definitely, of course, because they didn't say it, but they had got the dose right, because they were trying to figure out, and I, lots of respect for Lisa and Chris and the team at Imperial, because they really did a good job of figuring out how much DMT to pump in at what speed to basically keep us in a plateau as high as possible for as long as possible. So the last dose was really fucking
Gallimore,
strong.
Gallimore wasn't a part of that calculation with Strassman. I think I read it somewhere.
I don't know actually what it could be that they started with those calculations. I'm guessing.
Got it.
I'm sure they asked about it. But it was different because the experience is qualitatively different each time. I mean, with it, no, not massively different, just like in terms of how long we were in the state. So that fourth dosing, it was very strong. I almost puked, and I could feel you got like headphones and eye shades on, and I could feel the sort of energy of the team in the room being like, "Oh shit!" He's, and it was really, I was fine because I was like, I have to purge something. I had to get something out of my throat, and I was like, I don't want to puke here. I just don't want to puke here. So saying to the DMT, and it was like, okay, you don't have to puke, but you've got to get this out. So I was like, and then immediately it was like, right, okay, biographical stuff done. And then it was really metaphysical, purely metaphysical.
Wow.
And it was, I was in this huge, massive ecosystem full of entities. So it wasn't like my previous experiences. I had been sort of floating in different areas and voids and like different like landscapes, and entities would sort of come and go, like they would kind of appear, and I would have an encounter and then they would go. In this, it was just like being in the rainforest, and they were just everywhere. And it was just mind blowing. It was a really, it was an overview effect type mystical experience, in the sense of feeling like what astronauts saw from when they saw the Earth from space, in the sense of really recontextualizing. It's a beautiful experience because your ego is fine. Like, you don't have to do anything with, like, it's like your ego is like there, but it's just really unimportant, in the grand scheme of things. But that also doesn't mean that there's any kind of like, oh, I'm becoming one with everything. It's a different type of experience. It's like you are all like an equally important point of consciousness but so fucking tiny in the vastness of all the intelligences. So that was really meaningful. I talk about that in the book in a fair amount of detail as well, and towards the end. Yeah, it was a great ending for my story too. Yeah,
that is a great ending. Would you say the entities that you're describing in this scenario, were they also in front of you?
Yes.
Okay, because usually they kind of like here, and you can kind of see them in the periphery, but here you're talking about like full on just.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. That very often was the case, where there was some sense of like, that was how I broke through a few times, or at least once. I had this sense of like something's in the periphery, and I turned, and I even thought I was going to hit the doctor who was on my right, because I was like turning my head. So in this one, but also the entities would often be, they would be peripheral, but then they would be in front of me, or I'd see them in the distance and then come close. But in this last one, it was very much of a sense of being like immersed in something, and they were almost in the fabric of where I was, And so that's when I saw the hyperdimensional chinchillas, as I called them, which were very McKenna-like, like really, they didn't look like machine elves, but the energy of just excitement jumping in and out of my body, speaking a visible language. And it was wild because, I was very conscious of the priming of having listened to lots of McKenna in my life, and I intentionally didn't listen to any Probably hadn't in a few years anyway before the trial, but it's obviously in there, right? It's like it was a big part of my life. And so I was like very conscious of that. And then when this particular encounter with these very happy, energized, chinchilla-like entities speaking a visible language, and I'm trying to speak it back to them, I was thinking, like, even during it, part of me was like, this is too McKenna-like. This is too machine elf-like. But the other point was, I was like, but it feels absolutely fucking like, it doesn't feel like I was looking for it. If anything, I was not looking for it. So it did give me pause to think, like, okay, look, it's extremely possible that it's just deep priming. It's also really possible that it's a universal experience. I just have to hold the duality of that. Yeah.
That's a really big sticking point to me. And yeah, that modality you just mentioned about holding both of the possibilities in view and just allowing them to land where they're trying to land. What I always do, so luckily for me, I guess, just in the sense of deciphering between what might be more universal and whatnot, I've never actually seen any of the visuals that Terence was talking about. And Terence is, one of my favorite of all times, obviously, he's incredible. And yeah, I consumed so much Terence that you would think that I would see some self-dribbling jeweled basketballs, but none of that ever. In fact, I never got that whole folkloric kind of even shade of the experience. But what you just talked about, that's a really big sticking point to me, because it became clear to me that we can still tell the difference. And I know that probably even you still kind of disagree with me on that, but I really think we can tell the difference. Like, I think that if we put enough effort into ourselves, and not just allow ourselves to be carried away with every single conviction we have, if we hold that long enough, we can make the difference between what was kind of drummed into us by other speakers and preferences, and then allowing, almost like you go in there and just allowing it to be what it is. And then sometimes things would appear, for example, for me, that I know that, okay, maybe because they have a certain vibe, I was like, okay, maybe that's what Terence saw through his psychology.
Yes. Because
Because obviously he was one of the best speakers in history, so they always told him, look, you can make objects with language, which makes perfect sense.
Yes.
To me, it's always a different tone, but I can see sometimes similarities in function that I'm like, okay, maybe that's what his brain translated as that. And I get, maybe insisting is the wrong word, but I can't think of a better word. I am insisting that if we allow ourselves to trust our judgment a little bit more, I think there's something there that can actually help us bring medium-sized ideas, like you said.
Yeah.
Because I think that this idea that only scientists are the only people in the world that are trained enough to not fool themselves, so leave it to the scientists to try and get at the bottom of whatever it is, I think this idea is oversold. I think a lot of people are really good at critical thinking, and they just dumb down their own ability to do so. And I think that at the moment, globally, we are the biggest lab that ever existed, in that we have the interconnectedness of the internet. This is how we can utilize these tools, like what we're doing right now, right? Yeah. There's a certain signature to how a person talks. And you can kind of tell if they're the type that just kind of gets carried away with whatever, or they're the person who's like, kind of holding their ground. And yes, it's not like we measured it and it's number 5. Okay. But there's still data there. And I guess I'm emphasizing it because it's so important, I think, that as we go into these experiences, to be aware of that yes, it is very important that people like Chris and like Lisa would be there with the chart and actually do the meta-analysis on the situation, 100%. But there is still a lot of data to be drawn by the level of conviction of a certain kind of person who's usually not that easily convinced, let's say. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely know what you're saying. Yeah, and I think, like, basically what science is, or scientists are often like much more reticent around, is qualitative data. Like the actual qualitative is, what is it like to be you, right? What was that experience like? What's really interesting, like having been part of a study, is just looking at quite how much. Sure, they took a lot of quantitative data about what was happening in my brain, and what was happening in my blood, and my response to flashing lights as compared to the DMT experience, all of that. But really, the whole psychedelic renaissance is based on qualitative change. That, hey, will this help someone who's depressed? Will this help someone who's anxious? Will this help someone who's addicted to something? That is a qualitative change, right? So a lot of what they were also looking at, the data that they got, was us talking about it, them being like, okay, this happened here, then what did this happen, like. And it was interesting, but sometimes I would say something like, I remember at one point I was said like, oh yeah, then like, it was about when the DMT came in, and I was describing it to Chris, I think, after one of the first dosings. I was like, oh, then I matched the frequency of the DMT with my energy. And he was like, what do you mean? And he really got like stuck on that point. He was like, what do you mean? And I for me, I just said it. And then but it was really funny because I was like, why is he so interested? There must have been a reason, for someone else might have said something, and it was something, a theory maybe he had. So that was really, stuff like that was quite interesting, because yeah, having a science of qualitative experience, like phenomenology basically is that, but being good at phenomenology, I think is one of the key skills to understand like what is going on with these experiences. Because we can, you can show me a brain scan of my brain on DMT, it tells me nothing about any of it. I just see a particular lens, right? So it has to be, it's also still important, but it has to be mixed with that qualitative experience and a science of literally going in and, yeah, like you said, like discernment, understanding of cognitive biases, understanding of all that, just holding the multiple possibilities. It's also possible, some people argue that these are all like Jungian archetypes, but then I'm also like, okay, well, what's a Jungian archetype? This is a qualitative experience. Like, what is actually fair enough, but like that's not really going to change what the agency was of the entity that it was talking to me, or the information it gave me. It's like, could be. But I think that
if the information is real and actionable, who cares if it came in what you call a dream, or it's actionable in the real world?
Yeah, exactly. And you could argue, I mean, Peter Kingsley, amazing classicist, has written a book about, and mystic, about Jung, called Catafalque, where he's arguing that Jung was a mystic in the prophetic tradition. Basically he was a prophet in a sense, in the meaning of that word as it's understood, like kind of a little bit more in religious studies, right? And so in a sense, like, I often do wonder, Jung's like, oh yeah, let's call them archetypes. But I'm like, that's a wild thing to claim, man, that there's these deep embodied, encoded ways of being. And Jung said there's many different archetypes as there are type of human experience. I'm like, well, there are also as many different humans as there are type of human experience, and perhaps as many different other entities as there are type of other entities and experiences, right? So it's a bit, he was perhaps pointing to something much deeper than we can quite grasp.
Yeah, he really was kind of one of a kind in that sense. I know I have to let you go, so I just want to say that, first of all, I would love to do this again if we have a chance.
Yeah, likewise.
One thing that really kind of pulls a nice thread through everything you're saying, and it connects nicely to kind of the vision I have of how I see, like, my perfect vision of where humanity can be. And that is that left and right hemisphere thing you were talking about. It really feels like we have an opportunity here as humanity, as Earth, to combine the right hemisphere with the left hemisphere of the thinking Gaia mind, so to speak. And if you ask me, what is that vision that I see, like the best case scenario for humanity, it's this perfect merger between the Elon Musks and the Buddhas. Like, you take the best technical abilities and you allow them to be inspired by the divine. By knowing how to be, you create things that can do, but you do that in this dance, and it's interwoven. It's not two separate enterprises. So you expand it to the galaxy through technologies that are not just functional, but they're beautiful. They're also works of art. And you know what I mean? And that is something that I really see that the seed for this should be, if it's utilized properly, psychedelics, DMT in particular, but all of that. It's just bringing that into, it can be the glue that shows you that statement you just made my energy, I match my energy to the DMT energy. It's like, wait a second, what does it mean? There's something there, because I really think that whatever we experience is somehow primary. I really don't think it's an arising property, or if it is, it's an arising structure of already an existing thing that is part of what we see as the physical world. And I deeply thank you for the book, because it helped me think about things very, very streamlined, and it's a very complex subject. So it's quite an undertaking to be able to bring it to fruition. So thank you for that, and thank you for taking the time today. Before we jump off, I want you to plug everything you want to plug, including your new project and the book and everything else, where people can find you.
Thanks, man. Well, firstly, thank you. You are my favorite person to talk about DMT. You know, we had a long conversation unrecorded one time. It's just the most, like, it's like I don't have to explain everything from get-go, you know, on different things. So that's really enjoyable. And thanks for having me on. And yeah, plug. Well, the main thing is my book, The Bigger Picture, How Psychedelics Can Help Us Make Sense of the World, is the subtitle, by Alex Beiner, which is me. People can find that on Amazon and Waterstones and Barnes and Noble and wherever else. The Audible version is narrated by me. It's actually my favorite of the versions.
Really good.
Thank you. Yeah, it was the most fun to do as well. It's quite like, it's a different thing when you're speaking. And then I did just the other project is just launched. I launched a course called New Ways of Knowing, but it launched last night, so I won't plug that because it's not going to happen again until like September. So it's a ways away. But I am doing a psychedelic super conference that's going to happen in May, which people can check out on my website, which I'm hosting in partnership with Conscious Life. So that's the next sort of bigger project I have. Oh, and then finally, Breaking Convention. If anyone is, I'm one of the directors of Europe's longest running psychedelic science and culture conference, Breaking Convention, and we have a 1 day. Normally it's a 3-day event. We have a 1-day event coming up on April 20th in London. So that'll be a good one with a few interesting speakers, and it'll be a nice day for anyone who's interested.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you for taking the time, and we'll do this again.
Amazing. Thanks, Danny. Really appreciate it.